Canada's economy could go in two very different directions over the next year. And the deciding factor may be US tariffs threats on cars, steel, and aluminum. In a better version, growth slows but recovers. In a worst case scenario, Canada contracts for 4 straight quarters. What most people don't realize is the Bank of Canada actually threw out its normal single forecast playbook in April 2025 because US trade policy was too unpredictable to collapse into one number. So for the first time, they published 2 separate scenarios instead. The hiring freeze in Ontario and BC manufacturing is already happening. Hi, Kane again. I'm a theater grad that started with nothing. 20 years later, I own properties throughout Ontario. It took a lot of work. Watch my biography video to see my struggles. Read the references in the description below to see where I pulled this information from. If there are any errors, let me know. Without further ado, let's get started. That freeze didn't come out from nowhere. Canada's GDP was tracking at around 2.6% annualized growth in Q4 2024. Consumer spending was up, and the Bank of Canada was running its normal single forecast playbook like it had for decades. But the bank's own estimate puts Q1 2025 growth at 1.8%, so this slowdown was already baked into before the tariff situation fully landed. Between February and April, the US announced tariffs, pulled some back, threatened new ones, suspended others, then dropped a 10% uniform tariff rate. What that actually means in practice is the effective US tariff rate jumped from around 2% to a weighted average of roughly 22%, which is the highest in more than a century. Canada and Mexico got caved out of the worst of it, but only after weeks of nobody knowing if that exemption was actually coming. So, you had this stretch for about 2 months where the rules changed almost every week, and that's not just frustrating for the trades desks, it's the specific thing that makes a business owner in Windsor and Abbotsford say, I'm not signing that equipment lease right now. The Bank of Canada responded by scraping its single forecast approach for the first time in memory, publishing 2 separate scenarios in its April 2025 monetary policy report instead. That's not a small procedural change. The bank has published one unified forecast for decades, so putting out 2 scenarios is the institution saying plainly that the range of outcomes is too wide to compress into a single number. On inflation, the number looked okay at 2.4% March 2025 once you strip out the GST holiday noise, but shelter costs, rent, and mortgage interest specifically are keeping core inflation sticky. CPI medium ran at 2.3% and CPI trim at 2.2%, which means the bank has less room to cut rates than most people assume. Unemployment reached 6.5% to 7% over the past 12 months, and job postings were already pulling back across trade-exposed sectors before any tariff scenario had fully played out. Job postings move faster than the unemployment rate does, so a drop in postings in early 2025 is an early warning, not a lagging one. The reason 2024 strong numbers stopped mattering so fast comes down to how businesses actually behave. They don't wait for a recession to show up in official GDP data before they freeze a capital purchase or keep that equipment lease money in the bank instead of signing it. The bank's own Business Outlook survey confirmed that businesses hit by trade tensions reported weak investment intentions compared to those that weren't, and the gap showed up in Q1 2025 data. The economic damage didn't fully arrive yet, but the decisions that prevent damage has already frozen, and that freeze is now working its way into the labor market in ways that matter well beyond factory labor. Most people watching the housing market right now are focused on interest rates, but job postings and trade-exposed industries are already dropping as early as mid-January 2025, specifically in the sectors targeted by US tariffs, and that's a faster signal than anything the rate watchers are tracking. Ontario manufacturing sector and BC's exports industries, lumber, auto parts, machinery, sit right in the crosshairs of US tariff policy, and the Bank of Canada's report is direct about it. Hiring plans in these sectors have cooled noticeably. When a Tier 1 auto parts supplier near Oshawa pauses hiring because they don't know if their US customers' tariff costs are going to get pushed back down the supply chain. That pause doesn't stay inside one plant. It ripples into the local rental market within 2 or 3 quarters because the workers who aren't hired don't sign leases, don't rent storage units, don't eat lunch at the place down the street of the factory 5 days a week. And that's not just the workers who didn't get hired. Workers who already have jobs in trade-dependent industries are changing their behavior right now before any layoff notices go out. The bank's report notices that perceived job insecurity is rising specifically among people in international trade and export-reliant work, and that's translating directly into higher precautionary savings. So you've got employed people saving more and spending less because they're nervous about their jobs, which from a spending standpoint produces almost the same effect as an actual job loss. The money doesn't go down toward rent increases. It's not going toward a down payment, and it's not going toward the discretionary spending that keeps local economies moving. The pullback hits the exact rental markets that looked strongest coming into 2025. A lot of the population growth driving rental demand in places like Kitchener-Waterloo or the Fraser Valley connects directly to workers in manufacturing and logistics. If workers are worried about losing their jobs at a parts plant, they're more likely to stay in smaller apartments or move back in with family instead of renting a new apartment. That reduces demand for condo projects in places like Kitchener or Abbotsford that developers are counting on. In early 2025, job postings on Indeed started falling in the industries most affected by US tariffs. Job postings usually decline before unemployment rises. When businesses are uncertain about trade, they slow down hiring. Slower hiring hurts consumer confidence, and people who feel uncertain about their finances are less likely to rent or buy new housing. At the same time, a large amount of new rental housing is coming to markets in Ontario and British Columbia this year, based on demand expectations that made more sense before February 2025. How much softer that demand gets depends entirely on which tariff path holds, and the Bank of Canada has already told us there are 2 very different versions of where this goes. The 2 paths the bank laid out aren't just economic abstractions. They are specific triggers that move you from manageable versions into the one where Canada contracts for 4 straight quarters, and knowing which trigger to watch matters a lot if you got a mortgage renewal coming up. Scenario 1 is where most of the tariffs imposed since 2025 gets negotiated right away. Growth slows in Q2 2025, but picks back up after that, and inflation actually dips to around 1.5% in about a year. A big part why inflation drops that low is the carbon tax removal on April 1st, which the bank calculates shaves off roughly 0.7% points off inflation for a full year, about 18 cents per liter at the gas pumps. That carbon tax removal is a 1-year mask though. Underneath it, tariffs on US steel and consumer goods are quietly pushing prices up, so headline inflation feels calmer than it actually is. Uncomfortable, but manageable. Scenario 2 is where tariffs become permanent, specifically a 12% permanent tariffs on most goods and a 25% tariff on motor and vehicle content. Those are the 2 numbers worth watching in the news because that's the math that tips Canadian into recession. The bank projects 4 consecutive quarters of GDP contraction, and inflation still climbs to 3.1% by mid-2026, even with a shrinking economy. That's the irony of scenario 2. A year-long recession doesn't bring prices down, it pushes them up because tariff costs are running through the goods side of the economy at the same time demand is falling. The output gap reaches negative 1.7, and the bank is trying to manage both problems with the same tool. Cut rates aggressively to support growth, and inflation expectations could come unanchored. Hold rates high to fight 3.1% inflation, and the recession deepens. Rate cuts in scenario 2 are not a guarantee. For investors watching commodity exposure, gold has already moved higher as a hedge against this uncertainty, while agricultural prices are softening because China's counter tariffs are hitting Canadian seafood and pork exports. Those 2 are very different signals depending on what you're holding. For a mortgage holder renewing in late 2025 or early 2026, scenario 1 probably means modest rate cuts that take real pressure off your payment, likely settling somewhere near the bank's neutral rate midpoint of 7.75%, which is roughly where the bank thinks borrowing costs belong when nothing unusual is happening. Scenario 2 means deeper cuts are possible, but they come paired with a weaker job market and softer property values in trade-exposed markets. If you're looking for a rental property purchase, scenario 2 is more complicated than a rate cut headline suggests. Borrowing costs could drop, but rental market demand in manufacturing heavy markets like Oshawa or Abbotsford softens at the same time. So the spread between your financing costs and the achievable rent might not improve the way the rate cut number alone would make you think. Businesses in those markets aren't waiting for the GDP data to confirm which scenario landed before they act on it. Neither does the Bank of Canada, and they've essentially admitted their own tools can't predict which path we're on, which is why they publish 2 scenarios instead of 1. When looking at a mortgage renewal or buying a rental property, make sure you plan for both possible outcomes, not just the lower interest rates. In a weaker economy, interest rates may fall, but rental market demand also weakens at the same time, which changes the number significantly. At the same time, removing the carbon tax is temporary, lowering Canada's inflation rate by about 0.7%. But tariffs are quietly increasing the cost of goods. So, even if headline inflation number looks better, everyday prices at stores may still feel expensive. If you've enjoyed this video, then learn about the best passive income investments for Canadians in the next one here. Thanks for watching.